There you go. We are now going to teach you guys how to flow. So flowing is used throughout the debate by judges will flow, students will flow, some audience members will flow to organize and keep track of arguments. This is how you keep track of everything that comes up during the rounds. You don't have to keep it in memory. And it's a way to organize the argument so that way when you're speaking during the round, when you're presenting your speech, you're not just a jumbled mess. So does everybody have this down? Yes, no, think so. Okay. Tags. So what are you supposed to write down when you flow? Now you're not supposed to write down word for word everything that is said. You can't write fast enough and you can't think fast enough to write down everything that is said. So debaters often use what is called a tag. Tags are very short sentences or phrases that sum up an argument and are stated during a competitor's speech. Your tag should be less than 5 words. So say a tag would maybe be my value is better, or my value is the highest value, or not really. Like very short sentences or phrases that are used to basically sum up an argument, and then after you state your tag or the opponent states the tag during the round, they can go on to explain basically what that means. But a tag is basically just a little line or phrase you can write down so that way when the judge looks at it, they can remember the argument, but they don't have to write down paragraphs or sentences. So during a round, you do not want to write down every word or phrase, like I said, and instead take a step back and look at the big picture and record those tags. Now, if your opponent does not provide you tags and they're just rambling on, try and take a step back, maybe take a deep breath, and think about what that argument really means. What are they trying to say with this point here? So basically, tags are very beneficial. They're very helpful because that way you're not having to write down every little word and phrase. When I started LD, I wrote down a lot of information on my flows. I wrote down most of what they said. I wrote down specific phrases. But as I got better at it, I didn't have to write down as much. And thinking of tags while you're at the prep table or writing down tags becomes a lot easier as you do it. So it may be helpful for you guys to write down a lot in the beginning, and as you go, it'll get less. So don't feel like you need to write just a little bit, but write down as much as what makes you comfortable. These are just very helpful. Okay, so Josh has already gone over this a little bit, but this is basically what goes in each speech and where you write it on the flow. You guys have that piece of paper in your handout. So the way the flowing that people use in LD is called by speech flowing. And basically what it is it organizes each speech into different sections. And the very top section of the flow, or your piece of paper, is covered by all the affirmatives arguments. So in the very first column, you would write down the affirmatives case. And then when the negative comes up to speak, you would write all the responses that the negative has to the affirmative case in the very top. So this is just basically an outline of where things go on your flow. Now, to make flowing easier, like I said, there's not enough time for you to write down every word and phrase. A lot of debaters use shorthand, and shorthand is a method consisting of abbreviations and symbols used to write quickly. And shorthand is something that you want to adapt to yourself. I'm going to give you a list of different shorthand that I've come up with. You also have this in your handout, so don't feel like you have to freak out and write all these down. But these are just different phrases or shorthand that I use during a round, but I can still look down at my flow while I'm speaking and know what it says. Now this takes a lot of practice, sort of coming up with different shorthand, but you can really just adapt it to what you understand. Nobody else has to understand your flow besides yourself. Your judge is not going to look at it, your opponent's not going to look at it, but just make sure that you understand what you're talking about and you can really adapt your shorthand. So now I'm going to teach you guys how to flow. So if you guys can flip over a piece of paper, or if you guys brought extra note paper, you can use that as well. A lot of debaters use legal pads, so they'll go to like Office Max, or they'll go to Staples and they'll buy legal pads, and those already have lines on it, and they'll turn it sideways, so that way it's nice and long for them. And then what they do, or what I do, say this is the top of the paper, so this is your paper. They will draw sections for each speech. terrible, I know, forgive me. But what they'll do is they'll basically just section off the piece of paper for each speech. So this would be the affirmative constructive, which is the very first speech in the round. Then they would label the second column as the negative constructive. This is the first affirmative rebuttal. Then there's the only negative rebuttal. And then there is this second affirmative rebuttal. So they would organize their flow like this. So this is called by speech flowing. And so when, say you're the negative and you're sitting down in the debate round, you'll be sitting at the table and you'll flow your opponent's arguments in this column. You write down the tag, like say their value is, like last year a lot of people had the value of utility. I would write U because that was my shorthand for utility. So I didn't have to write down the whole word utility. And then their contention 1, I'd write down the tag for that, contention 2, and I'd write down the tag for that, and any subpoints or examples. And then I'd get up and I'd cross-examine them, and then I'd sit back down at the prep table and maybe think of some responses. Now when you do your responses, what a lot of people do is they draw a line from that specific argument, and then they write their response here. So they would write their response, drawing a line so that we know which argument you're addressing on the flow. And then I would say my negative speech, my negative constructive in my case would go at the very bottom here of the negative constructive. So then when the affirmative gives up to speak, they would put their responses down here. So basically the flow is kind of split into two halves. This is all the negative, this is the arguments against and for the negative, and this is the arguments against and for the affirmative. So that is basically how you flow. I'm going to read you guys one of my cases from last year while Danielle flows it on the whiteboard, so you guys can kind of get a picture for what it is. I would encourage you guys to flow along. It's okay if you get lost or I'm talking too fast, but flowing really comes with practice. The more that you flow, the easier that it gets. Here's again that list of shorthand if you guys want to take a peek at it while you're flowing. And don't be ashamed if you can't flow very well right now. I did not flow very well at all my first time trying. It just comes with practice. And you can even go on YouTube and watch Lincoln Douglas debates and flow those as well. You can flow other people's speeches and whatnot. So it just comes with practice. And so I'm just going to read you guys. Where's the teacher? So I'm going to read you guys my case that I debated with all of last year for the first resolution. We've gone over case construction. Okay. So if you look over there at the shorthand, towards the very left column has shorthand for basically kind of the tags for what it is. So when I say my value is, what I would do is write a V, and then I would write the value. So that way that's the tag for the value. And then for criterion, I would write CRI, and then for contention when, I would just write a C1 right before I write the tag name of what that actually is. Does that make any sense? Do you guys have any questions? Any questions?
What's the very first thing we should write down?
The first thing that they should write down, I just wait until definitions.
Okay.
Most people start with an opening quote. I think that was covered in construction. You don't write down the opening quote. You don't have to respond to the opening quote. And a lot of times, especially this year, the definitions of what things are most of the time going to be the same. So I would only write down ones that were obscure or different that might have an impact on the round. And then they can only write down, say, the tag of the value and the tag of the contentions. But they don't have to write down every bit of analysis, maybe just the subpoints, the tags of the subpoints and whatnot. Everybody's ready? Because I agree with Christian Kampf that, quote, the goal of education is to produce thoughtful people, capable of judging matters of general importance in a disinterested manner, with maturity, with a wealth of general knowledge, and with the courage to face facts. A society without trained workers will not get its work done. But a society without educated citizens will collapse in times of crisis and wither away in times of ease and prosperity. Because liberal arts equip citizens with critical thinking skills, which is necessary for freedom, I stand resolved. In formal education, liberal arts ought to be valued above practical skills. To aid in today's debate, I have a few definitions to clarify our arguments. Formal education is classroom-based, provided by trained teachers. Liberal arts education is education that teaches one how to think, learn, see things as a whole, enhances wisdom and faith, and makes one a better teacher. Practical skills is means skills performed by hand or with human intervention, using equipment, tools, technology, requiring guidance, force, or movement. Next, I'd like to share two resolutional analysis points, or what the resolution is and is not asking. The first being that the resolution is not exclusive. Again, the resolution is not exclusive. The resolution does not ask me to prove that we should only teach liberal arts and not any practical skills. It is asking me to show that liberal arts should be given priority. The negative might have several convincing arguments about the merits of using those practical skills. However, unless he shows that those skills should be valued above the liberal arts, then the affirmative deserves the ballot. My second resolutional analysis point is of the purpose of formal education. Again, the purpose of formal education. According to Kim Jones, the CEO of Curricula, an online community used to share curriculum and the best teaching practices, the purpose of formal education is to prepare children for citizenship, teach cultural literacy, and to cultivate critical thinking skills. My value or measuring stick for today's debate round is that of free democratic societies. Again, free democratic societies. Operationally defined as a value is a society that values liberty, life, equality, and justice with a representative government structure. My value link, or how this even applies to today's debate resolution, is that citizens with critical thinking skills are needed to protect free democratic societies. With these things in mind, let's jump straight into my two contentions or arguments in support of the resolution. Contention 1. Democratic societies require citizens with critical thinking skills. Again, democratic societies require citizens with critical thinking skills. Critical thinking skills are essential in the citizens of a healthy society because this allows for a built-in safeguard to protect democracy and freedom through the people. Subpoint A. A liberal arts education was critical in the founding of the United States. An example of this is in the Founding Fathers. These men were steeped in the classical liberal arts, which resulted in innovative leaders and individuals with critical thinking skills who had the capacity to build the American Republic from the ground up. As Danielle Novice noted about Thomas Jefferson in the Washington Post in 2012, quote, Jefferson's liberal arts education propelled him to help revolutionize the world, succeed at most challenges he undertook in life. And this diffusion of knowledge he sought for all citizens today remains an essential part of the American mind, end quote. Subpoint B under this first contention is a free democratic nation continues to need citizens with a liberal arts education. As the U.S. law establishing the National Endowment for the Humanities stated that Congress finds, quote, an advanced civilization must not limit its efforts to science and technology alone, but must give full value and support to the other branches of scholarly and cultural activity in order to achieve a better understanding of the past, a better analysis of the present, and a better view of the future. Democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens, end quote. In other words, a free democratic society must contain citizens with the capability to understand and analyze, aka those critical thinking skills, in order to keep that society free. Which leads me to my second contention or argument in support of the resolution. A liberal arts education best provides those critical thinking skills. Again, a liberal arts education best provides critical thinking skills. A liberal arts education provides the thinking and reasoning skills needed for a free democratic society. According to topuniversities.com, quote, a liberal arts education extends beyond academia and the workplace to give graduates the necessary qualities that can enable them to adapt and thrive in the world, communicate with and advocate change, and understand other members of the community, and had a broadened perspective. Or in summary, critical thinking skills give students the tools they need to thrive and communicate and actually advocate change. Which leads me to my subpoint A under the second contention, that of conversely, totalitarianism regimes eliminate the use of critical thinking when teaching their humanities. Again, Conversely, totalitarianism regimes eliminate the use of critical thinking when teaching their humanities. As Ham Kwang-bak, a former student of North Korea, noted this year that, quote, most of what is taught is information that is to be memorized rather than debated and defended. He continues, in North Korea, we have philosophy books, but they only focus on the biographies of the philosophers and not actually what sorts of things that they taught. They don't contain anything that makes one question life or the societal system that they're living under, end quote. Totalitarianism regimes recognize the tools and abilities a liberal arts education would give its citizens, empowering them with the ability to think and question the views of their own government. I would like to leave you with this quote by John Adams, quote, I must study politics and war that my sons may have the liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. Let us tenderly and kindly cherish, therefore, the means of knowledge. Let us dare to read, think, speak, and write. Liberty cannot be preserved without general knowledge among the people. Thank you. So did anybody have trouble? I'm sure you all did exactly, but any questions on how, yeah, it's a lot of information and it's fast. So figuring out your shorthand is very helpful. So even just going online and watching a YouTube video and just trying to flow it is very helpful, because that way you get faster at it.
I think it'd be helpful if Danielle read what she wrote down there.
Okay, so starting off, she had her definitions, and they're all pretty standard except for liberal arts, where she was saying basically that liberal arts leads to morality, freedom, wisdom, and I was like, what? So I would question that definition, first of all, and so normally if I'm going to question a definition, I'll circle it, highlight it to bring up my own. Then with her resolutional analysis, she said it was not exclusive, as I mentioned earlier, and then she also talked about the purpose of formal education, and depending on what my case would be, I'd maybe say that formal education is to give us a job, since I'll be talking about practical skills, or I might just agree with her there. Then going down to her value, it was free democratic societies, and she didn't have a criterion, but she had a value link, essentially saying that free democratic societies links to the resolution because they are achieved through critical thinking, which is achieved through liberal arts. And she kind of explained that further down in her case, and that brought her to her first contention, where she said that democratic societies require critical thinking, and she talked about the founding fathers, and then she talked about how free democratic societies, again, need liberal arts and critical thinking. So when I wouldn't really have much to respond to that, because essentially that was her resolutional analysis, her value. But when I get down to her second contention, she talked about this study or this quote saying that liberal arts gives you more than work, it gives you critical thinking. She didn't actually tag that as like an application or evidence. So what she could say later on, if I didn't write that down, was that, well, she dropped my application and my evidence. So you have to be careful, even if they don't tag it as evidence or as an example. You have to make sure to write down something that could be used against you, because it was a study from a source. So then she talked about totalitarianism in Korea and kind of that example, and I would have a brief against Korea because a lot of people were bringing that up. And then finally she had this quote by John Adams, and I wouldn't even address that because it was just kind of an ending quote.
Yeah, like she said, I didn't tag my evidence, but that's part of taking a step back and looking at the big picture. Mr. Reeves talked about that a lot last year in club. He talked about just taking a step back, what are they actually saying, and thinking about that, and then responding to the meat of that argument. So even though I didn't tag it, if you're taking a step back and saying, oh, what am I actually trying to say here, and then you write something down. So sometimes they didn't bullet something, but I would create the bullet and write it down as a subpoint A or just a subpoint, even if they didn't do that.
And as you noticed, I went over where I should have been because I have big handwriting. And so I actually don't do the split the paper in half thing. I use two papers because I like to write more down, and my writing is a little bit bigger. And so that's what some people do too, is have two papers.
So I was going to ask you about that. Like, do you have
Yeah.
a special line?
Yeah, I don't even draw a line on mine. And actually what I do is I pre-print my flows on 8.5 by 14 paper, and I create a Word document with a table and I pre-print it, and I actually have a section here for cross-ex. And so I'll either draw a line for what I want to question, and I'll maybe write down something like I'll write down something there to help me remember what I was questioning, or I'll just draw a line here to know that it had a red flag on my head. As far as cross-ex goes and creating arguments, we're going to talk about this tomorrow a little bit, but whatever red flags pop into your head if you're thinking about it, that is really easy and is very helpful when you're trying to think of arguments. If you're thinking, that's a really extreme argument, or no, that's not what I'm saying, or that's not what I'm advocating as this certain side, then you can create an argument out of that. That's kind of how it goes, it's just whatever red flags pop into your head. The speeches, I actually would start writing responses while my opponent is talking. So if a general response pops into my head, I will write it out while they're still giving their case, and I won't wait for prep time to write out all of my responses. During prep time, I'll re-look over my responses and see if anything is the same thing on two different spots in the flow, and then I'll highlight those two, or I'll try and condense it or maybe clarify it during my prep time, but I don't save my prep time to write down all of my responses. I try and write those out while I'm listening. But if it takes you too long to think of a response, don't try and do that while they're talking, because then you're going to miss something. But if something just pops into your head, then go ahead and write it down during their speech.